And in this presentation, what I'd like to do is to discuss a little bit with you the concept of critical thinking, and welcome you, of course, to the class. Critical thinking is the process of assessing opinions. It is true to say that we all probably believe that we're entitled to our opinions, but we do take the stance in critical thinking that some opinions are, in fact, more reasonable than others, and consequently we like to think, therefore, that they are better than other opinions. Critical thinking consists of examining the views that you and others hold and the reasons for them. I'm sure you're doing this all the time, but when we talk about examining views, positions, they could be political, they could be social, they could be scientific, they could be religious even, and indeed some of those can be very touchy areas. What we mean by examine is to look more thoroughly into the presuppositions, biases, unstated implications that a person might have or value in the course of possessing a specific viewpoint on an issue or set of issues. The main purpose of critical thinking is not to make you more persuasive, necessarily, or even a better contestant against another person, but to try to improve your own individual ability to understand and evaluate what you and others, I might add, believe. So, while you may indeed become a more persuasive arguer or speaker by mastering critical thinking skills, we'd like to think that the reason that you become more persuasive is because you also become more logical, more coherent. And I and all of us, really, can benefit a lot by thinking more purposely about our behavior and about what we think and why we assert the many positions that we do throughout our lives. Critical thinking, among other things, is to think clearly about issues. Clear thinking about an issue involves identifying what we call an issue, and we're going to define that in a little bit, recognizing what positions people are taking on a specific issue, and then trying to understand what the arguments are for and against those positions. Of course, as the course progresses, you will learn a little bit more about what an argument is and how they are structured and what a basic definition of argument is. But for the most part, we will be discussing how to evaluate and produce good arguments from a critical thinking point of view. All of the steps mentioned here can be quickly defined, but they can't always be learned terribly quickly. And what we want to do at the end of all of this is to have the decision firmly in mind. What are the best reasons to accept a claim, reject it, or suspend judgment? I've already used a couple of critical thinking words that appear in the first couple of chapters of your textbook that we've adopted for this course this semester. Claim, argument, judgment, all of those have a somewhat more technical connotation associated with them in the context of critical thinking. So let's start with an issue, and this pretty much parallels what your textbook is going to say, so there's not new information. I simply propose to kind of elaborate on it and hopefully embellish it ever so slightly, perhaps provide you other ways of contextualizing what these concepts are. An issue can be said to be any point, proposition, statement, viewpoint being discussed or thought about, simply. You can also think of an issue as a kind of a question. Some particular assertion or claim that you have to decide upon. Issues can usually be stated in a specific kind of a form. One that we've adopted here for this course is whether, such as, for example, whether you should buy this car, or whether you should buy any car at all, or whether or not you should be taking an online course, or whether or not there is such a thing as global warming. If you express it in the form of whether, then the idea of an issue becomes, I think, somewhat more clarified. The way in which we settle issues is primarily through argumentation, although I'm not going to actually argue against the idea that maybe some issues are settled by somebody becoming a victor in a war, where the winner actually, by default, wins the day, if you will, on a specific issue. But if we're going to be rational about it, we're going to try to settle issues through argumentation, and the better the argumentation, the more likely it is that the position you've taken on that issue is to be believed or is reasonably true. Now, what is an argument? This is pretty much the meat of the course, and I will be expressing this concept in a variety of different ways. But this is the first attempt to try to show you, give you some idea as to what you're looking at when you talk about an argument in a critical thinking or logical sense. An argument can be said to be an attempt to support a claim, a specific claim, a single claim, by giving reasons for believing it or accepting it. The claim that is being argued for is what we call the conclusion, and the claim or claims given as reasons for accepting the conclusion are called premises. So really, this is about as technical as the jargon actually gets. We'll be spending a lot of our time figuring out what an argument is, what it isn't, whether or not there's a good argument, whether or not there's something offered as an argument but there's not, in which case we call that an informal fallacy, and we'll be talking, I hope, humorously and interestingly about fallacies as the course proceeds within the next couple of weeks. Arguments can often be confused with attempts to persuade. There are many, many ways of persuading people. Right now we're having a period of time that really is quite pregnant, if you will, with all sorts of issues that pertain to who should become president and what candidate says what. And we know that these people that are running for office at this point in time, as has been true probably just about any time there's an election period, are trying to persuade you to do one main thing, and that's to vote for them. I'm sure you've noticed, I don't think it's a sarcastic or cynical thing to say, that frequently politicians, people running for high office, will say things that are persuasive, but they don't necessarily give good reasons for it, or that you become persuaded because, not necessarily of the reasons that are offered on behalf of the claims or point of views that the candidates are offering, but for some other reason. Maybe they're just really nice looking. Maybe they're not nice looking, and so because of that fact, at least in your view, you decide that maybe what they have to say isn't all that valuable to you. Perhaps they don't seem to be, whether they're good looking or not, terribly credible. Credibility is, of course, very important, but what we're looking at principally when we talk about arguments that are offered in support of a position, political or otherwise, is the reasons that are given for the arguments and how those reasons connect to the conclusions that are inferred from those reasons. Not all arguments are made for the purpose of persuading, of course, and without a doubt, not all attempts to persuade are arguments. You can take that kind of a sentence, by the way, and put it in a kind of a Venn diagram that we'll be talking about later in the semester and see exactly the logic of what was just said there. When we talk about arguments and persuasion, sometimes we have a tendency to muddy the waters, as they say. We tend to cast more obscurity on the issue. So rather than worry about whether an argument can make someone else believe what you say, simply focus on its purpose of proving or supporting a claim. So if you detect something that can be reasonably called an argument, then you can say that that is an attempt to prove something, an attempt to support a specific sentence in that argument that is called the claim. The claim is also called, again, the conclusion. You want to learn the skill of identifying argument, and what you try to do, of course, is to, when you pick out something that really can be said to be an argument, you try to identify its conclusion and then supply its premises. In some cases, an argument only has a single premise. Now remember, a premise is a reason that's given to support the conclusion. Both are claims. One is a conclusion claim, one is a premise claim. Very often certain words or phrases, such as conclusion indicators, point to the conclusion is about ready to come on board. And you're familiar with these terms, I'm sure. Therefore, hence, we may conclude, etc., etc. Your book will have more of a table of the many different kinds of conclusion indicators that you might run across in an argument. By contrast, we have the premise indicators, and they alert you to the fact that there is a premise. And such words as since, because, given that, are words that can be used to introduce premises. These indicators are only a first clue to the parts of an argument, but though they are not always present, there are other techniques for spotting parts of arguments. So, in other words, the point there to be made is, while somebody may be giving you an argument, or you may be reading something that can be treated as an argument in, let us say, the newspaper, it may not necessarily contain conclusion and premise indicators. They are just implicit or tacitly implied. Here's an example. Let's say that a NASA scientist says something like this. Because we found evidence of erosion on the surface of Mars, we therefore believe that there was water on that planet at one time. Now the premise for this would presumably be evidence of erosion on Mars, and a conclusion from that premise would be there has been water on Mars. So the therefore is clearly there, the because is there. Think about it. What is the therefore? What is it actually, how does it function in this argument? You should be thinking that the therefore introduces the conclusion that there was water on that planet, that there was water on Mars. What does the because do? It introduces a premise. And so, when we have that situation set up, we have the makings of an argument. I gave those tapes and the DVDs to your colleague up there to give to you so I wouldn't miss you.
Which colleague?
That would be...
What did the colleague look like?
I know who she is. I can't think of her name.
Describe the
Carol
colleague.
Dales.
Ah, the blonde one.
The blonde one.
Okay. I'll go track her.
Hopefully it works. I tested them out on our VCR.
Thanks for doing that for me.
I'm sorry I was late.
That's okay. I really appreciate it. Thanks. See ya.
What may complicate things just a little bit in a case like this is that the argument previously stated, probably as it stands, needs an extra premise. And sometimes that particular premise that could be added is suppressed or just simply unexpressed. I would probably add something like the premise, erosion is usually caused by liquid water. You add that to the premise of the previous argument, and then you get a somewhat better argument that could be easily held up to our standards of evaluation as we apply them in critical thinking. Let's talk a little bit about 3 basic steps to critical thinking, at least as I conceive of it. Identify the issue. One method begins by spotting the argument that has been given. Remember that, as we just discussed, every argument does address an issue. If you can find an argument's conclusion, you can immediately identify at least one of the issues at stake. Try thinking about putting the word whether before the conclusion. Whether or not there's water on Mars, for example. Bear in mind that more than one issue comes up in a conversation or piece of writing. And so what you want to do is look for as many as you can and don't worry too much about whether you've found them at all. But if you find an issue that does in fact seem to be addressable in the format that we've just mentioned, putting whether or not such and such is the case, you will want to discuss or discover the claims that are associated with that issue for which somebody, maybe even you yourself, will be providing the reasons for the claim that is related to the issue. So in other words, let's say the issue is whether or not there's water on Mars. Certainly, one conclusion that somebody might want to draw is there is water on Mars. Another one might be there is not water on Mars. But both of those conclusions are related to the same issue. Here's an example. Whether or not hybrid vehicles actually help the environment and or your budget. Do they? That's an issue. You could express it a variety of different ways, by the way. Somebody might say, well, I just think that hybrid vehicles, if you purchase a hybrid vehicle, it's going to help the environment. That is a positive statement or claim that's being made under this particular issue. Going to step 2. Try to identify the subjective and non-subjective issues of questions. And of course, we're going to be going into some detail about the difference between subjective, non-subjective. Read for non-subjective. It may make it a little easier. The notion of objectivity or objective. What is non-subjective is generally what we call objective. I'm sure that the two spheres, so to speak, are not quite the same, the two domains, but they're close. Non-subjective, otherwise known as objective issues, are about non-subjective claims. And a non-subjective claim doesn't really have to be true. But if it is, it states a fact. So behind this critical thinking course, we have a kind of a philosophical commitment that a true statement is a fact. So if it is a fact, then it is true. So true statements equal facts. But in the case of a non-subjective claim, we're not worried so much about the truth as we are more in the domain of science, for example. Beyond Pluto, there is another planet, is a non-subjective, i.e. objective claim, even if we never find out the truth of it. What that means is that there is some quote-unquote truth out there, or some true propositions or claims, we just haven't discovered them yet. But the fact that we haven't discovered them doesn't necessarily mean that there are no facts to be discovered. If you felt that you were principally responsible in your own mind, or we human beings invent the truth, then probably some of this you would dispute. But from this point of view, there are such things as facts, and whatever a fact is, it consists of a true assertion or a true claim. However, if you now take a look at a contrasting claim like eggplant is a funnier word than broccoli, that could be true in some sense as expressed from somebody's opinionated point of view, but we would regard it as a subjective claim. It doesn't really have to be true at all. Unlike a fact about whether or not Pluto is the only outlying planet, or even right now is a planet. As you know, it was demoted within the past couple of years by the National Astronomers Union, I believe it was, and they redefined the concept of planet to exclude Pluto, so that can always happen too. It doesn't really say that there are no such things as facts, but it certainly does say that sometimes the interpretation of things that previously were thought to be facts changes enough to the point where we begin to doubt that there really was a fact. But that, of course, is a matter for Philosophy 100, not so much for Philosophy 120. Here's a method that is associated with this step. If established methods exist for settling a question, we regard it as a non-subjective or objective question. Astronomers have definitions of planets and know how to look for them. Hence, the question of a 10th planet is a non-subjective one. So again, getting back to this idea that Pluto may have been demoted, is Pluto really a planet or not? Well, if we have a definition that everybody agrees about, because we have established methods for determining the answer to a question, the answer to this issue, for example, then we regard it as non-subjective. Again, you might think of it more reasonably, or at least more intuitively, as objective. We make up definitions, there's no question about that. But by the time we have those definitions that are actually established, we are able to objectively state, for the most part, what fits under that definition, what concept is associated with that definition. The issue of planet is roughly the same. You can very truthfully say, by definition, a planet exists and has the following characteristics. Or if something exists and doesn't have enough characteristics to constitute a planet, you could objectively or non-subjectively say, well, that's not a planet. And I think that without making this too obscure, you'll probably notice that if you have a job that you're working at that has a high degree of technical jargon, that there are many, many objective or non-subjective kinds of claims and assertions that are made. My guess would be, for example, that it is an objective claim to state that blood pressure, based on my layman's understanding of this, a blood pressure regularly over 140/90 is probably not a healthy thing for most people. Now, maybe some of you that might be in a medical profession might say, well, of course that's true. But one thing seems to be true, that there is such a thing as having high blood pressure, and there seems to be a method of establishing that, aside from just the equipment you use, but an agreement that certain blood pressure is not healthy for an individual over a sustained period of time. Again, that's a question of a non-subjective or objective kind of issue. Identify factors that might influence your decision about a claim, but are in fact irrelevant to that decision. And this has to do with the fallacies, really, to a large extent, that we're going to be studying very shortly. Human beings are, of course, influenced by considerations that, strictly speaking, don't have to do with the truth of a claim, and we find that, again, when we're talking about politicians often. I'm sure that you and I, and many of us, have come to certain conclusions about what a politician, and I happen to be picking on them because it is, after all, that season to do so. Other people suffer these things too. We can criticize everyone. I can criticize myself even. But in any case, often we are influenced to believe or think a certain way about a claim that a politician makes. Maybe we believe that because a person is a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or a libertarian or a Green Party member, that because of the fact that they claim that affiliation, that what they have to say actually is something that you should believe. Well, think about it. Really? Was that always true? Don't you want to try to establish the truth of the claims that anybody makes, including these politicians, on a basis of a rubric or a standard or a method, or the factors we're talking about here that might enable us to make a judgment about the truth value of a assertion that somebody makes? A couple of generic examples about this. Sometimes we are impressed and persuaded by people just because of who they are, or just because how they say it, or whether or not the person is a friend or someone you do or don't like. That applies even to news anchors, usually people on CNN, I think, and Fox. And forgive my chauvinism, but it strikes me that the ones that happen to be female tend to be they're largely because of the way they look. But it probably is true of some of the men as well, which goes to show that we may have some latent chauvinism in our culture. But in any case, it seems important to news readers that they are, at least in our country, sort of more than news readers, but somewhat attractive, at least easy to take in terms of their physical appearance. That seems to have an impact on what we're going to listen to and who we believe. But in logic or critical thinking, we tend to disregard that almost completely. Now, on to what will make a critical thinker. Well, these are kind of psychological characteristics more than they are logical ones, or personality issues, really, you might say. Developing a kind of critical thinking personality is important. Here's one thing to consider. Inquisitiveness about a wide range of issues, reading the newspaper, listening to the news, going to the internet, reading books, good old-fashioned books, good way to satisfy your inquisitiveness. A desire to become and remain well-informed. Many people are that way, just almost by nature. Many people have to learn to acquire that desire. Alertness to opportunities to use critical thinking. You know, when you have the opportunity to use critical thinking on the job or in a conversation with somebody or when making a decision about something, then you should be alert to the opportunity to be able to do that. Trust in the process of reasoned inquiry. This course is about trying to help you develop more formally the methods by means of which you reach a conclusion through reason. Developing of self-confidence in your abilities to reason. Usually that comes with practice. A kind of open-mindedness towards divergent worldviews, which is another way of saying, trying to be receptive to what the other person has to say and be a good listener. Flexibility in considering alternatives and opinions. There's usually no one right way to do something, but granted that there may be a traditional procedure, one that works really, really well, and maybe so well that other people haven't considered an opportunity to look in another direction, at another alternative, in order to do or realize something. But let's face it, usually what happens is if we become too inflexible, we can reach the point of paralysis in our thinking. Some more. Understanding the opinions of other people, trying to really get clear on what they mean when they talk and what they're really arguing, what they're asserting. Being fair-minded, or another way of putting it, objective. There seems to be a movement away from using the term objective in our textbook and in many other textbooks in the 21st century, but, fair-mindedness and an attempt to be objective in appraising the reasoning of others and your own, that's a good quality to have. An honesty in facing up to the fact that we all have our own biases, prejudices, and stereotypes. Discretion in suspending, making, or altering judgments. So, in other words, when you use that kind of phraseology, what you're saying is you want to know when you might have to alter a judgment or a presupposition or suspend a belief for a period of time until you maybe get more information. And a willingness to revise and reconsider views when necessary, your own views particularly. We all have to do that, myself included. I am not by any means going to promote myself as a perfect critical thinker simply because I happen to be facilitating this course. So we all need to bear in mind what makes a critical thinker, and if we're really serious about it, try to realize many of these characteristics. What else can you get out of critical thinking? Well, it should enable you to explore alternative ideas or solutions to problems. It should enable you to make reasonable predictions about outcomes based on the evidence that's presented that's related to the prediction. Clear thinking and writing, using logic or critical thinking, and certainly realizing the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, among others. Identifying faulty reasoning, assumptions, and biases, usually as they're expressed in fallacies that we'll be studying. And making informed judgments about the worth of ideas and arguments. So in other words, when you should be in a position, I'd hope that we all arrive there at some point in time, to be able to kind of assess whether or not an idea or an argument that's being presented is a reasonably good one.